Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome, welcome. We're just going to be waiting a few seconds as people start entering the virtual room. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll get started in just a few seconds. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Maya Chupkov, and I am the Media and Democracy Program Manager at California Common Cause. And I am pleased to welcome you to the second event in a special series on how media policy can help support local and ethnic media in California. This event series is brought to you by California Common Cause, PEN America, and the California Media and Democracy Working Group. We love for you all to introduce yourself in the chat box and tell us where you are coming from. The purpose, I just wanted to give a background about the California Media and Democracy Working Group before we dive in. The purpose of the working group is to find and advocate for state-level policy solutions and community-based solutions that will help sustain California's local and ethnic media so that comprehensive, fact-based, and independent reporting reaches all communities, no matter what language they speak, zip code they live in, or format they consume media in, thus creating a better and healthier democracy. Before I hand it off to our moderator, there are a couple pieces of housekeeping before we get started. As you can see, we are using Zoom webinar, which means you won't be able to turn on your camera or unmute. And there are two functions here. There's the chat function. If you want to send your own messages or make a comment, you can use the chat function. There's also a Q&A function if you have a specific question about the content or if you have a question for our panelists. We will be doing a Q&A for the last 30 to 45 minutes of the program. So please, if you're comfortable, include your name and affiliation in the chat box. It'll help us get some helpful context, and start putting your questions in the chat now if you have questions before we get started. This event will be recorded and shared with registered attendees. It'll also be on the event page on penamerica.org and PEN America's YouTube page, as well as California Common Cause's YouTube page. Now I'm going to bring up our poll to get a sense of where people are coming from. Do we have that poll ready? So yes, this is a poll that just so we can get a sense of where folks are coming from today. What industry are, what is your primary work area? So if you can go ahead and fill that out, and then we'll share the results so we can get kind of an idea of where folks are coming from. Let's give it a few more seconds and then we'll share the results. All right, so we have a mix of a lot of different areas. We have journalism as the most popular, and then we have advocacy, and really just across the board, which is really awesome to see. So I would love to introduce you to our moderator for this event, Hannah Waltz. She is the U.S. Free Expression Program Coordinator at PEN America, where she leads the Media Literacy and Disinformation Defense Program, advocates for support for local journalism and community media, and defends protest rights. Take it away, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Maya, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm really, really excited to introduce you to our panelists briefly. I think we'll be putting the full bios in the chats, but for now, I just want to say welcome. As Maya said, I'm from PEN America. PEN America, for those of you who aren't familiar, we stand at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. Our advocacy and training initiatives focus on book bans, equipping writers who face online abuse, providing guides and training on campus free speech, and supporting writers at risk around the world and more. Today, we will be talking about community-based media policy solutions and how they may apply to California. We have a great panel for you today from experts and leaders who are advocating for local and ethnic media at the community level. And I just wanted to say thanks so much for participating in the poll. It's really great to know who's kind of in the Zoom room, and also really heartening to see that we're gathering here to create such a multidisciplinary approach to supporting community and ethnic media. And so to save time, as I mentioned, we're going to be dropping the full bios into the chat, but I am going to just do brief introductions. So for those of you who are just listening, and you can kind of know who we're speaking with today. So onto the panelists. Brittany Barsotti is General Counsel for the California News Publishers Association. Darlie Gervais is the Advertising Boost Initiative Manager for the Center for Community Media, where she serves as a resource for community outlets in New York City on receiving advertising from the city's agencies. Simon Galperin is the founding director of the Bloomfield Info Project and the Community Info Co-op. Simon is a journalist, technologist, and organizer working in media and policy to strengthen democracy. Joaquin Wee is the External Affairs Manager and Policy Advisor for the Seattle Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, where he works across departments to help staff integrate effective immigrant and refugee-focused strategies into communications, outreach, and engagement work plans. And finally, Arturo Carmona is for nearly 2 decades, has used his leadership and experience to bring people together on important challenges impacting communities across the nation. And today he represents the Latino Media Collaborative in La Opinion. Thank you all so much for being here. So welcome to our panelists. It's always kind of, strange when you're in a virtual room and there's not a round of applause, but I saw Joaquin do that as well. So I'll also give you all a round of applause. Thank you so much for being on this virtual stage with us. So I thought, as kind of a grounding question, as today we're going to be discussing community-based media policy solutions specifically, as they may apply to California, I wanted to kind of kick us off with a question about the language we're using. And I would love for each of you to just, kind of briefly kick us off by defining community-based in this context and how you think of it in your work. So Darlie, can we start with you?
Yes, sure. Good evening, everyone. In our work, community-based for the Center for Community Media is a news organization, or can be ethnic, can be in a particular community, but that publish a meaningful news to their communities, whether or not it's a niche community, whether or not it's a bigger size of media, but it's a kind of news organization that speak for these communities with like meaningful on news that can impact the life of people in their community.
Thanks so much, Darlie. Joaquin, can you go next? Do you mind?
Sure. For the City of Seattle Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, we define ethnic media as any communications outlet that intentionally produces journalistic news stories or other content for a particular cultural or linguistic group or ethnic community residing in the US.
Thanks so much. And Brittany.
Hi, everybody. When we think about community, it really can vary based on how you define your community, right? So whether that's your ethnicity, whether it's a part of a city area, like San Francisco has different neighborhoods frequently, or the LGBT community, ethnic media. It can really, it just depends on, like, I think the first question is like, how to find your community that you live in and what's important to you and what are those shared ideals, right? But from our perspective, it's any outlet that really serves a specific area of the population, whether that's a neighborhood, whether it's a city, whether it's Northern California, whether it's the LGBT community, a different ethnic subset. It can really be anything that you feel is your community.
Thanks, Brittany. Arturo?
I think my colleagues here have defined ethnic media the way I would define it. The only thing I would add is that from the Latino community perspective, I guess I could differentiate it that way, is language really matters, especially for a significant population of the Latino community, folks that communicate in Spanish, Mixteco. So the language piece and the region, right? Rural, coastal, or urban, very small niche community in Pico Union, or East LA, or the suburbs of the mass metropolis of Los Angeles differentiate very, very much from an Imperial Valley out in the desert or in the Central Valley. So a lot of diversity, a lot of language, cultural, generational differences is also something that for me is very top of mind when I think of ethnic media, especially as Latinos evolve, and as now you see large, significant majorities speaking English and consuming news in English, yet you see major gaps in terms of outlets. So we'll talk about that a little later, but it's a complex and evolving sector.
Of the emphasis on evolving. And then Simon.
This is a really good question, and I didn't have an answer until you asked it. So for us, community-based, and this is something we're striving towards, right? And we're always building towards, striving towards, is community-based news is where the editorial agenda is set by people's information needs, where the product is created by the people it serves, and the organization is governed and or funded. We could talk about the models around that, governed and or funded by the people it serves too. So at all sort of these levels of production and ownership, the people who are being served are represented in it.
Thanks so much. I think, increasingly as language changes and the way that we talk about this kind of journalism changes, I'm really excited to hear from all of your different perspectives. So thanks for taking the time and defining what that means for you all. So, as we continue in the discussion, specifically around policy solutions and what that support can look like, I'm wondering if we could, kind of explore some of the key differences between statewide policy approach and community-based ones, just so that we can kind of, again, ground us in what that looks like in comparison, and how community-based approaches can be more effective. Definitely taking volunteers. If not, I can toss it over to folks.
Person who goes first always gets an A. So I'm going to go first, just to get that out of the way. I think that, and I'll go very briefly, I think it's just that the opportunity at a local level is that you get to start with people's info needs and you get to do it in a really deep participatory way. That's like kind of the process becomes an impact as well as versus just, traditional sort of grass tops approach. So that's what I'll add.
Yes, I agree with Simon that with community-based, you ensure that those either the small, based on how you approach ethnic media, the smallest neighborhood, if the publication small, is the voice of this particular neighborhood, whether it's small, so you that can ensure that they get fundings for them to produce better news content. And when it is wide, with my experience, for example, with New York State, they have a lot of consideration they are making, tax laws and a lot of things that might block smaller outlet from getting access to fundings.
I think it kind of depends on the state necessarily and like kind of how you define community. Like in California, we have 58 counties. There's a lot of delegation to the local level when it comes to policy and funding mechanisms. And so from that perspective, it can still be community-based, even if you're doing something structurally at a state level, or or if we're looking at advertising or public notice, for example, making sure that these communities that are small are placing their legally required notices and publications. That helps support a lot of small and local media, and it also keeps people informed about what contracts people are there bidding, like what changes in water policy, changes. There's like 1,400 statutes that have public notices in them. So there are a lot of examples about how that could be a statewide perspective, but that is designed to make sure that small communities have the information that they need, and that it also helps support the local level, those microcosms.
I
That's
think
great.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna call on you next, Joaquin, but I just wanted to highlight something that Brittany just said. You can have these policy approaches that aren't mutually exclusive, right? And so I'm going to be very interested in how we talk about this throughout the conversation as well, both community-based and statewide. But Joaquin, since you're working for the city, I'd really love to hear from you on that note.
Yeah, I think one key difference is that at a local community-based level, these policies often have a much closer relationship to, and as such have a much greater impact on the residents and stakeholders. And that can be absolutely awesome, speaking as a local government policymaker myself. But the flip side of that is that the impact overall can be quite small. I mean, especially as compared to the entire rest of the state, for example, which is at the state government level. That entity has the opportunity to help community members in municipalities that might have lower capacity or lower budgets, like lower county or city budgets. And another key difference, I think, which became very evident during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, is the speed upon which entity moves. I would say overall that, at least in the Washington state context, local municipalities move much faster in developing community-led policies, financial aid programs, and also in relaying accurate information much faster than our friends at the state level. But because we had that head start, we were able to meet with our state counterparts to assist them with information about best practices, what works and what doesn't work, as well as policy recommendations. So overall, I think it's always important to, when possible, not be so siloed about this work. Of course, keeping in mind jurisdictional issues, blah, blah, but sharing information across governments, I think, has been one of those practices that, to use an overused metaphor, that truly can be like a rising tide that lifts boats and helps communities everywhere, not just in one, city in a state.
One of the, if I may, Hannah, one of the things we've been pushing through the Latino Media Collaborative over the last few years in partnership with other ethnic media coalitions or individual outlets and other partners is for there to be kind of a transformation of the way the state looks at communications and whether it's through grants or ad revenue or just the knowledge that PIOs, public information officers, have, because the reality is a lot of them don't even know about the existence of ethnic media. We've been shocked when you're looking at major departments that need to get public health information or emergency services, and they don't know the main communicators to our communities. So you really need to go to the top, and we to Joaquin's point, it's been very difficult. It's taken years. We've seen very slow progress through leadership in the legislature and gradually in the governor's office and some departments. But what we've realized that it's these kind of department by department solution is not gonna be the way. We really need to have a systemic approach that looks at the whole. And so when we've been working with LA County, for instance, and now with the city of LA to pass motions and resolutions that allow these municipalities to look at communications from an equity lens, because the whole state, now the county or counties, municipalities, I know for a fact that city of LA and LA County, I know the state as well is doing this. You also have to look, and ensure that communications is a part of that, because communications impacts everything. And when you want to get resources of information or engagement from communities, especially a state as diverse as California, multilingual, multi-generational, we really need to understand that. And so we're excited to see that there's progress, especially at the local level. It's moving a lot faster. But the work continues. And so, in a bit, we could talk about some of those examples, but yeah. So it's been exciting to see kind of the trajectory, both at the local and the state level.
Arturo, actually, if you wanna address those examples, I'd be happy to give you the floor to talk about that a little bit.
I mean, the challenge that ethnic and community have in working with large bureaucracies is that most outlets have, small staffs, right? They have a reporter or an editor that's doing a little bit of reporting, and a salesperson and just a team of 3 or 4. You have bigger ones, you have smaller ones. And they don't have, a lobbyist, or they don't have a sales rep in Sacramento or even in the county. They're worried about selling to mom and pop stores or local businesses that are trying to promote themselves. That's been their model. And so as we guide these outlets to diversify their funding during a time when the sector is contracting, it's hard for them. So we want to find counties and cities and the state adapting their procurement practices, where you don't need a large media agency that ends up cobbling most of the revenue, actually. And so we've been saying, hey, you need to generate policies, procurement policies. You need to generate grant making practices that make it accessible, that don't make it overburdensome. And so we're starting to see some examples at the local level, at the state level. But the procurement hurdle is a huge one. I think the capacity building is another big one. I alluded to it earlier. And I think New York's done a good job of mandating across all departments, capacity building of everybody that's engaging with communities. Anybody that's investing $1 in communications needs to understand the communications apparatus in their region. And so we need that in California, because the state has transformed in its population, its diversity, but the bureaucracies have lagged behind. And the reality is that they're far behind, especially at the state level. And so our work continues to be cut out for us. And at the city of LA, we've passed 3 ordinances, 3 resolutions over the last 6 years that mandate some of these things. It's not as comprehensive and as strong as what New York did in terms of capacity building, database development. Obviously, we know about the advertising mandate as well, but there's so many layers to this that, and in LA County, there's been some adoption of that, at least in the database development, some trainings that we've been able to do, data gathering. There's been some reporting that's been put together, and so it also, but the experience has also taught us that we need big and bold leadership. Otherwise, change is gradual and very slow and not efficient. Not efficient. Resources continue to be unutilized when we know, in major departments, health, economic development services, when we know there's a huge need in a county as large as LA. So we know that communication continues to be a challenge. And I mean, those are just a few examples, Hannah, that I could quickly point to.
Thanks so much. So I'm wondering, Darlie and or Simon, if you two want to talk a little bit about New York's approach. Darlie, I know that you're very much on the supporting end of that and your experience, successes there. And Simon in New Jersey, I'll defer to the order that you two want to speak at, but I would love to hear kind of especially successes there.
To follow up on what Arturo said, at the city levels, education is a key point, and support to the publishers and the news organization. It's really important to ensure equity, because we might have the legislation, even with the mandate. Some smaller organization in the first year of the New York City mandate didn't find advertising, didn't get any advertising. I have to say that, to give other people who are not familiar with that, a brief to let them understand that the Center for Community Media has been working for hundreds of publishers in finding pathways to sustainability. So when the executive order was passed by Mayor de Blasio, it was really at a critical point for the center, and it was the time that our work had started. Because of relationship the Center for Community Media has established with community media, we understood that we needed to strengthen the news organization, the small news organization, in order for them to be at the level to receive advertising. And effectively, the center has launched my program, Advertising Boost Initiative. And the first 2 months, I had noticed that not only it was important for all publishers to be aware of the process, or it is being done. Other than that, they would have been left behind. And also the education part on not only people crafting the campaign, who did not, as Arturo said, didn't even understand the landscape of community media, but as well those advertising agencies receiving the chunk of the money to distribute money in community media. This is very important. And any legislation, any policy, any, in my experience, any executive order should have with them those support mechanism in order for them to be effective. Because if we don't do that, the money might be available, but the funds will still be going. They are bigger community news organization. They are the one that are totally at the level, if you call community level standard. But there are some that are the lifeline as well as their community, whether it's geographic or small or community, but they are at risk of not even receiving those funds available. They'll just pass them. And that's why CCM toward the 2 years has been working, strengthening them, giving them resources, giving them trainings, create media kits for them, peer-to-peer, cohort-based peer-to-peer workshops to put them at that level where anyone designing government campaign will not say that that you're too small, that's not the reach that we are looking for, that we make sure that they are ready to get their fair share of advertising. And I'm sorry, as Hannah had said, we want to hear some success. I have so many great success. The Advertising Boost Initiative in the first year works with 80 plus news organizations. Some of them had never received advertising, although the mandate existed, but the fact that we were able to guide them, daily calls with publishers, I got their feedback. What do you need? I talked to them. What is the problem? Did you receive advertising? I would talk to publishers daily. And what did I do after I talked to them? I didn't hesitate to call those advertising agencies, receiving the chunk of the money, to say there is a problem. At least 50 or that least didn't receive advertising. Where does the money is going? Where the money is going? And the first 6 months, I did realize that the money was still going to the same chunk of maybe a group of 50 media, a news organization within the same community media, and they continue to ignore the small one. And there was a shift then in the first year where I encouraged publishers, send me your media kit. CCM create a repository media kit. And every 3 months, I will send an email with those media kit to the very people designing the campaign to say, here it is. It is the list of community media. You cannot ignore those outlets as well.
Thanks so much, Darlie. Well, first of all, congrats on the successes too. Simon, did you want to talk a little bit about the Bloomfield Information Project and the success?
Sure. So, yeah, I think that the advertising initiative that CCM did is fantastic, and then it's sort of in New Jersey trying to be replicated as well. And I love what Darlie had described about the sort of interstitial role CCM gets to play between the publishers and the government or other local stakeholders. And I think that that's like a critical model for us to examine as we get into the grassroots of this thing. Is like, what is that interstitial layer between the public and local stakeholders and local leaders? In Bloomfield, New Jersey, which is just north of Essex, is in Essex County, just north of Newark, also just south of Montclair. So we're sandwiched in between the richest, one of the richest and most white communities, and one of the poorest and most Black communities in the state. And we have we're at crossroads of the state, and we are trying to come up with a new model for local news and information that's based on people's news and information needs, a 21st century version of public media at a hyperlocal level. We've envisioned the creation of this thing called an info district, a special taxing district that funds local news and information. There's about 4,000 of them in California that exist. They fund libraries, water, utility services, all these things. And we imagine that these can fund local news and information services too. So in New Jersey, we're working on building the products and services that can begin to help restore our local news desert. And we've had some successes there. But I think what I want to amplify is the success, how our successes have been dependent on statewide initiatives, statewide success through Free Press, an advocacy organization, Journalism and Democracy Advocacy Organization. Their initiative to pass the New Jersey Civic Info Bill to establish the Civic Information Consortium, a public charity dedicated to funding local news and information projects. In the last year, they've given $1 million for a variety of different organizations, from training and capacity building to high school newspapers, to Haitian radio stations, to Spanish radio stations, to gaming competitions for black youth in Camden or somewhere in South Jersey, I forget where. So really think about a holistic approach to local news and information, and giving organizations like ours in Bloomfield the opportunity to explore what public service means in a real way, with this vision that we can get to a place where we know we need to be, which is we need to fund local news and information as a public good. So what does that local news and information look like? What is the technology? What are the workflows? How are we involving people? Those three things I started off with: info needs from the people, product created by the people and governed by the people. So how do we build towards that? So that's some of the work we're doing in New Jersey. And obviously, I think that California, being the state where often a lot of the sort of structural governmental progress occurs, is ripe for a conversation like that too.
Thanks so much, Simon. Yeah, so turning back to California, Brittany, I know that you are, intimately familiar with some of the, legislative challenges that California publishers face. And I was wondering if you could, kind of talk about those challenges, but also, how specifically better policy can protect community and ethnic journalism, as well as press freedom, public access to government records, and holding the powerful accountable.
Sure, that sounds great. So, and stop me if I keep talking because there's a lot. Like our state, California is special, and we like to legislate a lot, is how I like to say it. So, and for a little bit of context, the News Publishers Association. So we have 850 members in the state of California. That's a lot of small ethnic. I mean, I've got the big guys, but I also have a lot of the small guys too, right? And we try and work closely with, like Ethnic Media Services, Latino Media Collaborative, and California Black Media, and some of our other ethnic media partners in this space. And I'd say probably like 98% of what I do is focused on access, right? So it's a lot of public records access advocacy. This year, everybody wants to completely rewrite the Brown Act, which, if you know anything about local government, that is the legislation in California that defends the public's right and access to open meetings. And there's, two bills this year, one of which is very problematic, AB 1944, which would basically rewrite it so members of a body wouldn't have to show up to a meeting in person or tell you where they're meeting from, or provide, because historically you have to have access to a teleconference location, you have to notice it, and it has to be available to the public to also participate from. And this just wants to rewrite that to provide local government folks with convenience over accommodation, right? And we're working very hard with a coalition to narrow that and hopefully defeat that bill, right? That's a primary objective. But I've also done a lot over police transparency over the last couple of years. So access to police misconduct records. We fought really hard on 1421 and SB 16. We also worked very closely with some awesome folks. Shout out to Adam Rose and Matt Pierce, LA Press Club, and Pacific Media Guild. I saw you guys in the chat. If there's other folks in there, I'm sorry I missed you, but we worked really hard on SB 98 to ensure that press have access to protests and can no longer, aren't supposed to be detained by officers. And if they are detained, they have the right to immediately appeal that detention to the supervising officer, which has been a huge issue, particularly made clear over the last couple years when it comes to, the protests following George Floyd's murder, and a number of the other issues that we've seen. And so that's like 98% of what I do. I do work on advertising, but most of that work is focused on First Amendment issues. So making sure that advertising, for example, doesn't violate the First Amendment by being overly regulatory of speech, right? And then other issues as they come up, but typically that's my primary focus. So I might be for the publishers, but we focus a lot on making sure that the rank and file press have access to what they need and can hold local government accountable, right? Because that is the critical role that the press plays in democracy. And so backing up a little bit, some of the issues that we face, in terms of policy at the state level and what that looks like, we've been working really hard, like over the last couple of years, and this year, especially, you know, to help enforce what, you know, like the work that Arturo and some of the other ethnic media folks have done to show that, you know, there are all these programs California wants to do, right? Like we're spending a lot of money on like homelessness efforts and mental health and, you know, establishing this care court thing and different grants for different projects and, you know, all these concepts that are supposed to serve underserved communities. But if the information isn't getting to those communities, then what's the point? Right. And so we see that as a really key area where we can partner, you know, with the state without having to create some of the stickiness that can happen when the state is directly funding media in terms of like issues around the First Amendment and coverage and like, you know, is it going to be curtailed because the primary role of the press is to question the government. That's how the fourth estate functions, right? Like that is our goal. And so, you know, that's a natural alignment. It's like, okay, the state's decided to spend the money to do these programs. They've decided it's important to serve these underserved communities, which we're all in favor of, but they need to make sure that the information and that the outreach for these programs goes to the communities that they're designed to serve. And so that doesn't have any of the big budget fight issues necessarily, right? Because it's money that the state's already dedicated to spend. So you don't have to say, hey, like we have this extra budgetary ask, right? Because that's, or creating a new tax, right? Because if we're talking about creating a new tax, that's a 2/3 majority that's required to pass that out of both houses, and the governor would have to sign off, right? So that's a procedural obstacle that can come up when you're talking about that type of a solution, or if you're talking about additional grants and some sort of special fund, right? That could become problematic, especially when gas is like $6.50 a gallon or something. I don't know. My fiance works at Costco and it's like $6 there, and that's the cheapest you're going to find. So, you know, and we're also seeing, you know, like, you know, the counties and different groups are saying that they don't have enough funding for this or for that. You know, and so when we're, you know, looking at it, anything you can do to streamline solutions and anything you can do to offset maybe additional costs is going to go a long way, right? If you're streamlining a solution and, you know, like the advertising bit, that helps take away some of the naysayers, right? Because you're taking away the no's. And that's what you really need to do to be effective in the public policy arena, right? And you need to be able to convince people. I mean, the good news is when we're talking about programs that benefit the press, it is sometimes easy for them to write about, you know, which can be helpful. Not that we, you know, encourage things, but when, you know, you're talking about, let me do my job, like, let me cover the Brown Act, like, let me cover my local school board, let me cover, you know, these different issues that are going on. I need to be able to have access to a protest so I can do my job, right? That is a helpful perspective to have. But I think the problem a lot of policy work faces is making it understandable to the public and translating it into what it's actually going to do on the ground, right? Because you have the legislation, which is the idea, but then oftentimes you have the regulatory process, which is a huge procedural piece of the process that not a lot of people follow and understand, right? And that's where a lot of like the nuts and bolts of how these policies get worked out. And then you have how it affects the people on the ground, right? And you kind of, it can get difficult to like follow it all the way through, you know, which I guess is why I have a job. But you know, it's really like there's so many pieces to the puzzle, right? But having a clear ask, having something that is reasonable, something that you've figured out how to have a funding mechanism, because a lot of the problems and a lot of the bills that don't make it out of the legislature get held up in appropriations. And so, you know, you can have all the ideas you want, but the next question's got to be, how are we going to pay for it? Right? Because if you can't pay for it, then you don't really have something that's feasible, that's going to get worked out as a solution. And so that's probably enough out of me, but happy to keep going if you want.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Brittany. And I want to shift over to you, Joaquin, just to talk a little bit about the way that Seattle's ethnic media program has, evolved, but also talk a little bit about the accessibility of, kind of understanding how we can implement these policies that Brittany was kind of alluding to. Yeah.
Sure. When Seattle's ethnic media program first began, it was set up only to answer just one basic question. And then later on, we started to answer more questions. But the first question was, what are the media outlets in the greater Seattle area serving immigrant and refugee communities? So we took a community organizing approach to the start of this work, which included visiting immigrant-owned restaurants and grocery stores to see what publications they had available by their entrances. It included making sure that at each meeting with community members and advocates, we added the question, oh, by the way, where do you get your news, especially news about what's happening in the country you immigrated from? And of course, it included visiting all the media booths at all the local cultural and neighborhood festivals. It took us quite a while. After this, we developed a pretty comprehensive list, but we also didn't want this endeavor to be one where nameless and faceless public information officers or PIOs were sending English language press releases regularly to an ethnic media email distribution list. So our next goal, again, I think that having a community organizing approach to this work is key. Our next goal was to meet in person with a representative from each of the outlets in the directory. So this was probably the most challenging part, but I prioritized coming to them, even if their offices were located far outside the city limits. For the vast majority of people I met, the first reaction, to be honest, was shock. Most had actually never met with a government employee before. I learned a lot about the histories of the outlet, whether they were connected to a larger company overseas. I collected media kits detailing ad costs and deadlines, found out about which outlets offered free translations, and of course, as a bonus, was treated to some pretty amazing food at a lot of these meetings, because for a lot of us in immigrant refugee communities, can't have a meeting without food, right? So this work led to a far more robust and comprehensive ethnic media directory, which I found to be much more helpful to PIOs and even to other nonprofit and government entities. But that was just the work I felt needed to be done on the media outlet side. So maybe that was like, well, 1/3 done. Now I needed to do the work on the government side. And to be honest, I feel like this work is even more challenging, because now my focus, which is my continued focus every year, is to talk with all the PIOs and all the outreach and engagement staff across the city to remind them to, when possible, like one, budget for, including an ethnic media component in your equitable outreach and engagement strategies for next year. This includes setting aside funds for translation or transcreation, design, and ad buys. Two, reminding staff or actually meeting with staff to take them through the process of how to appropriately translate press releases and social media posts and ads and other content, because, oh man, thankfully we've gone away from using the online translators and are now actually using community-based community members who are knowledgeable and are certified in these languages, and keeping those dollars in the community. And then three, I even have to talk with my fellow city staffers and take them through the process of how to even start an ethnic media campaign. I mean, people are starting from not 0, but like -10. Seriously, I have to hold some people's hands and say, okay, first, consider the community you're trying to reach, how large and which community populations are part of these communities. What is your budget? Here's how to send an email with the information and requests in it. Here's a template you can use to track costs, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you really have to to do a lot of hand-holding in certain government departments. And then the bad news is when that person gets all trained up and I see them doing really good work, they leave and then I have to train their successor. So it's never ending. Now, of course, I'm constantly trying to demonstrate to PIL is also another issue is, and I get this question a lot, the return of investment, ROI, which is also honestly quite challenging. But what I end up doing in a lot of cases is I do a lot of that tracking myself for the Office of Immigrant Refugee Affairs. So I am often tracking and are trying to exemplify or trying to be a model for other departments so that when I'm launching an ethnic media initiative or campaign for a specific new program or policy or service, I'm doing what I can to track everything and then to get information from each of the ethnic media outlets about click rates, if it's online, or publication rates and how often they're, or the amounts that they're distributing to restaurants or to grocery stores, how many are left at the end of that week or month, and then keeping those stats so that when I present to departments, I can show them, hey, we saw that when we had a question on our application, how did you hear about this program or service? It appears that 65% checked off the box that stated from a media outlet in my language or an ethnic media outlet that publishes or broadcasts in my language or my home language. And and then making sure that every time also I'm sending a translated press release to the different outlets that publish or broadcast in those languages, I'm seeing how often that press release makes it into a story, or to be honest, sometimes gets copy and pasted and slightly edited into a print edition or into an online post, or even into social media sometimes. So I'm also tracking that, and I'm letting departments know, hey, this is what we're seeing. But I have to do that less and less because obviously there's an equity argument to this, because most immigrant and refugee run small businesses or ethnic media outlets or nonprofits or small businesses that are BIPOC, that are Black or people of color, immigrant and refugee community members. They're, FUBU, they're for us, by us. And so just talking about that to folks usually is enough for them to say, okay, I get it. And so then the challenge really for me is just showing people how to do it, having them not be afraid to mess up, and just, again, as I mentioned before, holding their hands so that they are able to do it and then continue to do it well, and also encourage other staff members in the department to do that work. And of course, this is always, this is always, the ethnic media program is in a constant state of becoming. There's never an endpoint. Media outlets come and go. Thanks to the internet, there are, a huge increase in radio stations, online radio stations, and online news outlets and blogs that are publishing in languages other than English to new and emerging communities. So you constantly have to be on the lookout to talk to people and keep going and keep learning and remembering that everything is always in a state of flux, and that it's important to just remember that you have to be open to whatever changing demographics or trends are happening in communities, and also what are the changing demographics and trends with ethnic media outlets. And I'll put into the chat, this is the website that has a little bit more information about the ethnic media program, as well as a directory that you can use as an example for crafting your own directories. You'll see in the second spreadsheet in that Excel file is like an email list. So for people to send translated press releases, they can just copy and paste all of the Chinese language outlets, for example, slap that into their BCC, and then send it off. Same thing with, repeat for Spanish language outlets, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course, I've, in one of the spreadsheets, separated out the ad folks from the editorial folks, so that if you want to start that process of buying ads, here are the people you talk to. And so thankfully now a lot of my work is more the technical assistance. We kind of operate kind of like an in-house consulting firm within the city of Seattle infrastructure across departments, even to the mayor's office. And so that work has become really helpful because, sometimes it's just about that action and just knowing how to do it so that people are not as timid about doing it in the future, and it becomes a regular part of departments' work, especially departments with a lot of money, which are like the utilities departments and like the transportation departments, departments that have money from various sources, like especially federal or from clients and customers.
Thanks so much, Joaquin. And I want to take a moment to turn it over to Arturo, who does have to leave us early, unfortunately. But I want to build on what you said about in language access, and especially I know that the Latino Media Collaborative is very focused on this too. But Arturo, I would love to know how, just a little bit before you have to go, how you work together as a group, as a collaborative, truly to build consensus on community-based policy.
Over the last few years, we've been building, obviously, like in any coalition building, organizing, you have to build trust. You have to build those relationships and that rapport with the network. And so we've been able to do that in a sector as complex as the Latino sector, where you have corporate owned, where you have locally owned, you have hyper local outlets, which are just print, and you have digital outlets, you have broadcasts, you have radio outlets in the Central Valley or other more rural areas that have significant significant breadth in terms of the reach. At the end of the day, there's some common themes that bring us together, and that's fairness, equity, access to resources, because there's always turf issues, right? The print versus the digital, or the print versus the broadcast, or the urban versus the this and the that. So I think you just have to look beyond that. You have to see through that and focus on those things that bring us together, and also reach across ethnic groups, or reach across sectors. We have a very close partnership with the California News Publishers Association, but we work with other ethnic groups as well. And so it's been great. We're beginning to see good progress. It's a little bit slower for us in California, but I'm very excited about what we're seeing in LA, because I think to what both Darlie and Joaquin mentioned, I think you really have to have those regional examples to show the way on some of these things, because the media sector is very complex. It's changing. There's a lot of money, and there's profit motive as well, which also gets in the way when you're trying to enact policy. So you have to really have a well thought out policy and move it forward in a responsible way. So it's been great to be here, and I look forward to other opportunities. Thank you, Hannah, and thanks everybody.
Thanks so much, Arturo. Darlie, if it's okay, I wanna return to you. I know in a couple minutes we're gonna turn to audience questions. But I wanted to, you have a lot of experience on both the administrative side and as a journalist. And so I would love to hear from you on, your co-founding of the Haitian Times and your intense focus on women's issues. And I wondered if in that context, you could highlight the importance of centering those perspectives as they relate to policy improvements and how we might think about that. Oh, I think you're on mute still.
I'm sorry. Before I answer, I have to clarify my focus on women issue was most likely in my country of origin. I work with a publication where they were focused on violence on women. But here with the Haitian Times, I would say that there is there is a big impact with news organization like that receiving advertising campaign, government campaign advertising. You could see a big difference until now that I'm not part of the Haitian Times anymore. By the time we were there, we were doing really what I call meaningful journalism, going deep down into the issues, but not having advertising coming to hire more reporters. The outlet suffers a lot. You see people are sending you news information, and it's a community that's thriving, and you can't even send a reporter. Sometimes, as you know, if I want to compare the Haitian Times, some news organizations are only one or two people, the person who funded the outlet and one reporter. And it's really difficult. But now receiving fundings from advertising from the city, it allows the outlet to allocate fund, hire reporter, hire managing editor, hire, giving the publisher itself time to go out and talk to people in the community, not only talk to folks who know their issues, but talk to other advertisers, because you have a managing editor in charge. You have one or two reporters who can go out and who can come back with good deep bone story. And I think those policies really are changing the landscape of the news organization, and especially with my experience with the Haitian Times, I have seen it evolving into really a force with good news stories for the community.
Thanks, Darlie. I just really wanted to lift that up as you know, we look to examples and how experiences can be really important as we're thinking about policy. So I want to encourage the audience, again, if you have questions, either for the panel in general or for a specific panelist, please use the Q&A function. We'll be looking there. But I do want to start with a question that was asked earlier in the conversation. How can citizens in California and other states support these efforts? And so I think whoever asked the question, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, I think I take this as how can everyday citizens support these efforts, and what kind of conversations can we have together as the general public? So we have a yes. So if anybody would like to start, the floor is yours.
Sure, I'll go. That's a great question. It's really important. I mean, I think the first, like, what example is like, subscribe to your local publication that you feel serves your community, right? Like that's really important. I think we got in the habit, like it's difficult because news is a public service, but at the same time, like if there aren't reporters, then if you can't pay reporters, then there's not going to be the content, right? Necessarily. And so that's really important. Another thing you can do is I get on like all of the little organizations, like we do a legislative update every week, or for the most part every week. And so you can sign up on an organization's website, like for our website, to get our weekly newsletter, and that'll tell you the different bills that we're following and the different issues we're working on. And you know, if you want to call into a committee hearing to say you support something or oppose it, or if you want to contact your local legislator, your state assembly person, or your state senator. I think sometimes we get like really focused on the national policy, but people, you know, don't always contact their local member, which can be a really effective way of getting your information across. You know, and just stay informed. So, I mean, like, I know we have one, I'm sure, I think Maya does one for the group, right? Every Friday, a newsletter that goes out. So the different organizations here probably have something, but those are kind of the simplest ways, I guess, to stay informed and to get involved in California.
Other folks, I know that your focus isn't necessarily California, but please feel free to answer according to your region.
I'll jump in here because there's Maya highlighted a question that was also for me, so I'll piggyback maybe if it's useful. I think it's important to recognize that there are places where we can't subscribe to local news organizations. There's nothing there, right? So I think for a citizen, a regular person of the community, like, get to know your neighbor, start a block group chat, find out what's going on, talk to the people around you so you can begin to see how you can begin to respond to these things yourself. On infodistricts.org, we have our How to Launch an Info District white paper. It's not about creating this particular policy outcome, but it's about creating the conditions where you have an engaged and connected ecosystem in your community. And it starts with getting to know people. So, just as Brittany said, like, we're always focused on these national issues, but getting to know your neighbor and being there to help them is the most impact most of us can have in our day-to-day lives. And it's in building those sorts of organizations and movements and groups at a local level that we can begin to imagine creating news services where none exist before. So to respond to the question that came through in the chat, info districts are special improvement districts that fund local news and information projects. They are established by a referendum or legislative process after having an information needs assessment conducted, figuring out what are the pain points, what are the things keeping our stakeholders siloed, our public disconnected from government disconnected from the public. And then let's create and design mechanisms together to solve for that. That might be traditional 600-word reporting. That might be a daily curated newsletter. In Bloomfield, we also do food aid SMS updates. We do programming and training. We just finished our first community reporter corps training. We have our ambassador program launching. We're doing block parties this summer and like participatory budgeting. And these are the kinds of services we can begin to imagine if we start from places where we know there's nothing there. So info districts, the idea there is that we can create a public utility to fund that civic engagement, fund that civic participation that we know we need to improve information, public health outcomes, educational outcomes, all these different things. And I love hearing sort of the role all the folks on this call play as this like connector and interstitial layer between all these stakeholders. And that's what I imagine we need at a local level to really thrive. So that's a little bit more about info districts, and there's more on infodistricts.org and policy papers and legal stuff and polling and yada yada. Was my audio better that time? Because I know last time it was choppy.
Darlie or Joaquin, do you want to take it? No worries. We can go to the next question if not, but want to give you space to answer if you'd like.
Oh, you can go to the next question for me.
I think for me, my message would be for local government officials, if you're still on the call. It's the same as some of what folks had already mentioned. Get subscriptions to local news outlets that are in languages other than English. You'll be surprised to, when you see what's on the front page and it's maybe image of the mayor or it's an image taken from another news story that is related to your city or local government. It gives you a sense of what are the values of these local immigrant refugee communities. Those values will be reflected in the stories they cover, in the editorials that are there. And, you don't have to read through all the, especially if you're unable to understand those languages, but you can use your smartphone. Certainly you can use, Google Translate to get a sense of what and how they're covering it, at least in the headlines. And that gives you an indication of okay, these are some of the issues that are impacting these communities. This is what they care about. And it helps you become a better public servant, basically, in helping or figuring out ways to develop community-led initiatives from immigrants and refugees. So I would say, don't just have the subscription to the newspaper that is the newspaper of record for your state or your city. Also include those smaller publications, and also include some time to explore, or if you have an intern, have the intern do this to explore some of the online stories that may be from some of these ethnic media outlets. It's much easier in that case because then you can use Google Translate to get a gist of the article and the headline. And again, it's all a part of helping inform you on how to best serve immigrants and refugees in your community.
That's great. Thank you. I want to encourage folks to ask your questions now. And I also want to say that I know that the Center for Community Media also has several really comprehensive directories of community and ethnic media outlets and specific groups. So I would just encourage folks to check it out. I can either drop a link or maybe Darlie. But it's definitely a resource that I would turn folks to, in addition to the Seattle link that Joaquin dropped in the chat earlier. All of this information is accessible and available to you on the internet, so it's great. If there aren't any more questions from the audience, I definitely have some more questions for folks. And Simon, I wondered if we could turn back to you in terms of how, I'm always curious about how to effectively encourage public participation. And I know that's a big focus of your projects as participatory media. And I'm interested also in encouraging people to opine on policy or how to educate people. And so I think we've touched on this a little bit, but would be interested in hearing from you and anybody else who has experience in that lane.
I have two anecdotes that are now connected in my head. One is we were doing tabling last year at Juneteenth, and someone came up and we're like, we're giving away free ice cream and ginger punch. And if you want an ice cream cone or ginger punch, just sign up for our local newsletter. Like, I don't want any more local news. I was like, well, it's Bloomfield local news. They're like, oh, wait, that's a totally different story. Turn to like just our community reporter corps that just ended, training that just ended, where we're teaching people these skills that we want them to employ to help inform their neighbors. And people are naturally coming to the conclusion that these things are public services that probably need to be publicly funded. So I think that it's really a matter of just building that pipeline for folks so that they can enter. Our idea is that we have this daily news product. It's Bloomfield's front page in a place that's formerly considered a news desert. So we curate local news and information for people, observing sort of everything that's happening online in our community, and giving it to them every day, and giving them a reliable source of news and information in a community of about 50,000 people. And that's our sort of entry point. That's our loyalty builder. Show up here, you will always get information you can use, from your tricky trade to the business opening to what's happening at the town council meeting. You don't need to pay attention to Facebook. You don't need to pay attention to all these things. Plus, you're going to be getting this positive social benefit. You can start showing up at our events. You can show up at our trainings. You become an ambassador. We build that civic participation pipeline so that, in a few years' time, we have hundreds of people in our community that are not just subscribers, but like active participants in our process. And I think people want that. We have a lack of civic participation in the country. There's no institutions really dedicated to encouraging civic engagement. Often the institutions that would benefit most from that civic engagement don't want that civic engagement either, because they are not prepared to deal with all of those inputs. So we think about creating this sort of clearinghouse for civic engagement and public information in the community, and using that to be the fire for civic engagement in a space. I think I think people know that the feeling of not having information about a subject, and we want to inspire them to what will they and their community feel like when we don't have any more of those feelings, when we know everything we need to know, and we can live our best lives here and thrive here and shape the world in our image, right? So that's the kind of language we like to use when we think about inspiring folks towards civic participation in local news.
Thanks, Simon. And I would welcome anybody else to answer that question as well. How do we light that fire?
I think in my perspective as an assistant publisher, I think with even with outlets that are not at a level to publish newsletters, whether or not they have small staff, once you have a subject that are close to the people's heart, once you have articles that touch their lives, they are like on fire. They are on fire, and that's what people need to look for. I can point out to a last report by the ransom report by the New York Times about the relationship between France and the Haitian community and Haitians, and where the multiple stories is about how France make the country pay for a ransom, a kind of independence price, freedom price, and Haitian Times run that story, and it's like tons of people coming to the site and comment. So any stories, that's what I say, meaningful journalism, any stories close to the people's heart, and that's what I said, it's important for publishers, whether the role is different with what Joaquin was talking about, visiting publishers, but it is important for publishers to know the issues in your community. You cannot be above your community, and bring those issues to life with your outlet, and definitely that will connect you with your community.
Thanks, Darlie. I would probably start with Joaquin, but no pressure. But we have another question from an audience member. And if you could give an example of how a statewide policy can complement a community-based policy.
Yeah, certainly. Unfortunately, here in Washington State, we are still quite far from a statewide policy focused on media outlets that serve immigrants and refugees in languages other than English. But what I can say is that because of my work and because of crises such as the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that we just experienced and still continues, many government entities across Washington State have started to pay more attention to how immigrant and refugee communities get their news and information, whether from social media, smartphone-based discussion groups, or traditional print outlets, or new and emerging online-based outlets. So we at the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs are often called upon to present to communications and outreach and engagement staff from departments across the state, also city and county governments, state government staff, of course, and other policy-focused nonprofit community-based organizations. And overall policymakers want to include ethnic media in their work, but they just don't know how. So it starts here with the technical assistance, with the panel that we're all on today. And the hope is that with every new and successful and effective ethnic media campaign, we get closer and closer to formalizing this in policy, both at the local level and the state level. And also, I would have to say that in my meetings with ethnic media outlets, I think that a lot of these more small businesses or small nonprofits, they kind of forget that they have power to not just write stories, etc., but they also have power to advocate to their elected officials outside of the realm of writing their stories. So they can join their local ethnic chamber of commerce, for example, or band together and form their own ethnic media campaign. Talk to candidates during election season to let them know that if they want to meet or if they want to reach this constituency, this voting constituency in their particular community, then we're the newspaper that has this many that has this high amount of subscriptions, placements, etc. So I kind of have to slyly remind outlets that you also have the power of advocacy, and that you can have meetings with folks to say, hey, we are experiencing the same challenges and problems as these English language community media outlets, whether it's the local alt weekly or the legacy, municipal based newspaper, except while, they're experiencing a cold, we're experiencing the flu. It's much more difficult for us in terms of decreasing subscription rates or decreasing, ad buys from community members. And so I kind of have to let folks know that, if you want more departments to budget and to, spend more money on ad campaigns, I'm doing what I can from inside, but, you also have to kind of do your work from the outside. So it's, again, from the community organizing standpoint, it's the inside game, outside game, right? And so with the outside game, there has to be a continued push to advocate for dollars and for support and for attention to ethnic media outlets.
Let me continue. I was about to talk about the support since Joaquin already explored that. I don't need to go back to that. In my daily calls with random publishers, there is a question I ask, what would be the budget for you to be able to be comfortable and having really reporters tackle on issues of community? For example, some publishers might tell me, if we have $250,000, that would be a good operation. Some might say, I just need 150,000. So yes, of course, concretely, I'm going to give example of state-wide policy when you decided to say that, wow, 82% of our budget is going to mainstream media. I'm not saying that they cannot have any advertising in mainstream media, not at all. And at a certain point, 18% was going to 400 community media. It's really not unbalanced. So now, concretely now, 15 million the past 2 years. The first year was 10 million. 15 million shifted to community media. And with that now, let's say 15 million concretely go to 400,000. It went to 283 community media. Right now, the center is at a moment where the center is going to state to advocate for state funding to go to community media. So one publishers receive from that 15 million, receive $80,000, which is great. But if the center succeed in looking for more funds now from the state to come, 80,000 plus another 80,000 give you 160,000, and that publisher will be comfortable at the level. So yes, it's complementary, and that's what we are doing right now. We are doing that right now, trying to make sure that the money is there. It's just that the key holders, they don't focus on that. And right now the focus is there with all those conversations. We hope to be successful in bringing more money from the state level to have together with city in order to have a healthy ecosystem of community media in New York City.
Thanks for building on that, Darlie. I think that was helpful context too. Brittany, I'm curious on the California side if you had anything to add.
I mean, I think they gave some great examples. I mean, I guess some recent examples we'd see, like, is particularly with the COVID-19 outreach, around the vaccine. That's another huge piece, because there have been certain ethnic communities, particularly like with religious subsets, that have been hesitant to get the vaccine because of stem cell use or whatever, a lot of misinformation going on in different communities. Another really great example, I think, is the census in 2020. A lot of our ethnic media partners worked on outreach for the census. And so that's a good example of the federal government policy dovetailing with communities to do the outreach that they needed to do, and got grants for that. And also another recent example was with the Visit California campaign last year. So the hospitality industry was one of the hardest hit by COVID, right? Open and close. And we were in a space where we weren't really advocating for outside the state travel due to COVID-19 and the pandemic still being a very real issue for a lot of folks. And so the state decided to spend money advertising for people to travel within the state. So to kind of limit that exposure as a way to kind of, boost, but also, it was nice to actually get outside for a while. I don't know. I've been pretty cooped up during the pandemic. But that's another example of how these kind of statewide policies can dovetail into the communities because they were doing local outreach for traveling.
If I could add something to the state local connection, is I think that there's so many things we could do at the state level to unlock opportunities at the local level. Everything from these sort of existing spending reform, from advertising spending to public access franchise fees. There are limitations set by state governments on how those things can be used. That's existing in the town of Bloomfield, but $600,000 a year is coming in to our community. That ends up going to the general fund and or paying for a small proportion of public access, a small portion that's going to pay for public access TV. So there's already lots of dollars out here. So the question of shaping, how can the state level policy shape what's possible at the local level is super important. Yeah.
Thanks. And so I know we just have a couple more minutes. So I want to give, this is always if you had one thing that you could just knock off your wish list to move forward amazing policy that's going to save all community media, what would be the golden key for you all? And I would love to hear a little bit from each of you if you're willing.
I would say, in my experience, to make the funding available, because the publishers, those publications in their communities, they know their communities better, and when you empower them, you have tools also to disseminate city and government messages. So they are the right tools for that. So in my experience, since I'm more likely myself focused on having funds available for them to try to stay open, for their door to stay open, I would say that is regulate. When I say regulate, I think Arturo was talking earlier in money available, but with different big company ad agencies between. So do some kind of regulation right there in order for the money to go into the right, the hand of the right people. And equity, it's important to talk about equity. The money might be there, is the distribution of advertising is doing equitably. That is really important as well.
So for me, I dropped a link into the chat. It's an opinion piece on the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. So it's federal legislation that will hopefully be moving forward soon for the Congress to pass. But for me, that's endgame, right? Because a lot of the issues around funding and sustainability have kind of come up from the publisher perspective as we've transitioned to digital. Print is still the primary revenue driver, and Facebook and Google operate and they take 90% of the advertising online revenue, right? And then you also have them sharing, utilizing content for free that local members produce. And so this bill is, like I said, it's at the federal level. It would allow news outlets, primarily small and ethnic publications, to collectively bargain with Facebook and Google for their share of advertising revenue and content, similar to what's been done in France and Australia and has been really effective there. And so for me, that's endgame, right? Because we're getting closer and closer towards the final, towards transition to digital. I mean, there's some elderly folks who are always going to be print, right? Or different communities that prefer print. I mean, I prefer print, but that's because you know, I don't know. I worked in the newsroom for a while, and so like I like having something tangible in my hand. But to have a sustainable online model that you know, continues to work and provide content and generate jobs, that's what I see as the end game right now.
I would say that executive orders are great, but they only last as long as that executive often. So really, if you can codify legislation that set asides and that ensures that departments within a government infrastructure are actually devoting a certain percentage of their outreach and engagement funding to outlets that serve immigrants and refugees, I think that is the standard. I think that's what it should, that's a policy that local and state governments should be ascribing, should be working towards. And then, of course, making sure that that funding is there as well, and also making sure that in that legislation that it does have the appropriate and necessary community input. It should be a community-led and community-driven process. So making sure that those stakeholders are at the table, not just the media makers, but also the communities that those media makers serve.
And
My turn. Go ahead,
yes,
go Maya. Feel free to
no,
wrap us up.
you,
Okay.
you,
I was gonna
do it.
say, local, state, and federal funds for local news and information, info districts, civic information consortium, national endowment for news and public news and information. We really need to invest a ton of money in creating the new system rather than investing money in maintaining the old and helping people incrementally transition. We need a big transition. So we need a big pool of money to make that happen.
Thank you all so much. What a great conversation. I really appreciate all of our attendees for staying with us. And as a reminder, we will get the recording to all attendees as well as on our YouTube channels. So please look out for that. And then I'm putting a feedback survey in the chat. It will also be sent via email. If you can just give us your feedback, that would be much appreciated so we can improve it for next time. Thank you again so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you to you as well.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.